April 12, 1945. General George S. Patton walked through the gates of Ordruff concentration camp in central Germany, and what he saw in the next 60 minutes would haunt him until the day he died. The smell hit him first, a thick, sweet rot that made battle-hardened soldiers turn away and vomit into the dirt, grown men who'd seen combat in 3 different countries suddenly unable to control their own stomachs. Bodies were stacked like firewood near the crematorium, some still smoking from the SS guards' desperate attempt to destroy evidence before fleeing, the smoke rising in thin black columns that carried the smell of burning flesh across the entire camp. Patton had spent 4 years leading men through the worst combat Europe had ever seen, had walked through towns demolished by artillery where buildings were reduced to rubble and streets ran red with blood, had seen soldiers torn apart by machine gun fire and watched medics try to save men with wounds that couldn't be saved, but nothing in his entire military career had prepared him for this moment. He stopped at a shed where emaciated corpses were piled 6 feet high, their skeletal hands frozen in positions that told stories no one wanted to imagine, their faces locked in expressions of terror and agony that would appear in his nightmares for months. His aides said they should move on, that the general had seen enough, that there was no point in torturing himself by looking at more. Patton shook his head and kept walking deeper into the camp, his jaw set and his eyes hard, because if his soldiers were going to have to witness this horror, then he was damn well going to witness every single part of it himself. The Third Army had been racing across Germany for weeks, crushing Wehrmacht resistance and liberating towns faster than maps could be updated, pushing forward so quickly that supply lines were struggling to keep up with the advance. They'd been averaging 30 miles a day, sometimes more, smashing through German defenses that had been built to hold for weeks but couldn't withstand the fury of Patton's armored divisions. The German army was collapsing, everyone knew the war was almost over, and Patton's men were focused on finishing the job and going home to their families. Then advanced scouts radioed back about something strange they'd found near the town of Ohrdruf, something that didn't make sense in their initial reports. The radio operator kept pausing, struggling to describe what the patrol had discovered, and when pressed for details, he finally said they needed to send officers immediately because this was something command needed to see in person. Initial reports were confusing because the soldiers describing what they'd seen kept stopping mid-sentence, struggling to find words for things that shouldn't exist in the modern world. Patton arrived expecting a standard POW camp, maybe some mistreatment, conditions that violated Geneva Convention rules, but nothing that would shock a man who'd seen the brutality of modern warfare up close. If you want more stories about the moments that defined World War II, hit that subscribe button because we're covering the events they don't put in textbooks every single week, and trust me, what Patton did next changed how the world understood this war forever. What Patton found at Ordruff wasn't a prisoner of war camp where soldiers were held according to international law. It was a subcamp of Buchenwald where the SS had worked thousands of prisoners to death building secret underground bunkers for Nazi communications equipment, a facility that was supposed to help coordinate Germany's last desperate defense. The prisoners who survived, the ones who were still alive when American soldiers arrived, told stories through translators that made American soldiers weep openly, hardened combat veterans who'd killed men in battle suddenly reduced to tears by words. They'd been given 200 calories a day, barely enough to keep a child alive, let alone a grown man doing heavy labor, forced to work 16-hour shifts moving tons of concrete and steel with their bare hands because the SS wouldn't waste machinery on people they considered disposable. Anyone who collapsed from exhaustion or hunger was shot on the spot and dragged to the crematorium that ran 24 hours a day, the smoke visible for miles but explained away by guards as industrial work. The SS guards had fled just days before Patton arrived, running ahead of the American advance and trying to escape justice, but they'd spent their final hours executing as many prisoners as possible to hide the evidence of what they'd done. Some victims had been shot in the back of the head and left where they fell. Others had been hanged from meat hooks in the garage, their bodies dangling like sides of beef in a slaughterhouse. A few had been forced into a shed that was then set on fire with them inside, the charred remains still visible when Patton's men arrived to find bodies burned beyond recognition. Patton was 59 years old and had spent his entire adult life preparing for war, studying military history and tactics and strategy at West Point and beyond, believing he understood the nature of combat and what men were capable of doing to each other when nations clashed. He'd read every major military text, studied every significant battle in history, prided himself on understanding warfare in all its brutal forms. He'd fought in World War I, seen the trenches and the gas attacks and the wholesale slaughter of trench warfare where men lived like rats in mud and died by the thousands for a few yards of ground. He'd led tanks across North Africa where the desert's sun-cooked men inside their steel vehicles and battles lasted days without water or rest, where heat and thirst killed as many soldiers as enemy fire. He'd commanded the Third Army through France where artillery barrages turned forests into matchsticks and left German and American bodies scattered across fields like broken dolls, where entire villages were erased from the map. But this was different. This wasn't combat between armies. This wasn't soldiers killing soldiers in the heat of battle. This was systematic murder on an industrial scale, organized and efficient and designed to erase human beings from existence as if they'd never lived at all. He walked through barracks where prisoners had slept six to a wooden shelf built for one person, where men who weighed 90 pounds were packed together for warmth because there weren't enough blankets and the winter had been brutal. The walls were stained with fluids and waste because inmates were too weak to make it outside to the latrine, and the smell inside those buildings was so overwhelming that soldiers had to cover their faces with cloth just to enter. He saw the whipping post where guards had beaten prisoners for entertainment, not as punishment for rule violations but simply for fun, and the blood stains were still visible on the wood along with grooves where fingernails had dug in during the torture. He examined the crematorium where prisoners who'd been forced to help dispose of bodies or be killed themselves, explained they'd been burning 80 bodies a day, sometimes more when executions increased, and the math started adding up in Patton's head about how many people had died in this one small camp that nobody had heard of until 3 days ago. He asked questions in a voice that was steadier than he felt. How long had this been operating? Years, since 1944 at least, maybe longer. How many camps like this existed? The prisoners didn't know exact numbers, but they'd heard rumors of dozens, maybe hundreds scattered across Germany and occupied territories. How many people? Thousands at Ordruff alone, but there were whispers of bigger camps in Poland where the numbers went into the millions and the killing was done with poison gas instead of bullets because it was faster and more efficient. Patton ordered his staff to document everything with cameras and written reports, to photograph every building and every body and every piece of evidence, because he understood immediately that people back home wouldn't believe this without overwhelming proof. He'd been sending intelligence reports to Washington for months about Nazi atrocities, about mass executions and death squads operating behind the front lines, about entire villages being wiped out and populations being systematically murdered, and most of those reports had been filed away or dismissed as war propaganda because Americans couldn't imagine that a modern, educated, industrialized nation like Germany could do something this barbaric. War was supposed to be soldiers fighting soldiers, armies clashing on battlefields, not the organized extermination of civilians in factory-like facilities designed for maximum killing efficiency. Even now, standing in the middle of it with the evidence literally piled around him, bodies stacked 6 feet high and survivors who looked more like skeletons than human beings, part of Patton's brain was rejecting what his eyes were seeing because it was too big, too evil, too systematic to be real. The survivors who could still speak told stories that seemed impossible. They described selections where SS doctors would choose who lived and who died based on whether prisoners could still work, with the weak being sent directly to execution. They talked about medical experiments where prisoners were infected with diseases or subjected to surgeries without anesthesia just to see what would happen. They explained the system of punishments where minor infractions meant beatings, major ones meant death, and sometimes guards would kill prisoners for no reason at all except that they were bored or angry or drunk. One survivor, a Polish man who'd been at Ordruff for 8 months, told Patton through a translator that he'd watched 300 men die in the past month alone from starvation, disease, execution, and exhaustion. Another survivor, barely able to stand, explained that prisoners had been forced to dig their own mass graves before being shot and pushed into them, and the graves were still visible at the edge of the camp where the ground had been hastily covered. Then Patton made a decision that would echo through history and change how the world understood what had happened during this war. He ordered every available soldier in the area to tour Ordruff, to walk through the camp and see exactly what they'd been fighting against for the past 4 years, and what their buddies had died to stop. He wanted them to understand that this wasn't just a war about territory or politics or national pride, but about stopping something fundamentally evil. He ordered the mayor of the nearby town and every adult citizen to tour the camp, to see what had been happening 5 miles from their homes while they claimed they didn't know anything, while they'd been living normal lives and pretending nothing unusual was occurring. He sent messages to Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower and to every senior officer in theater telling them to visit concentration camps being liberated across Germany because the world needed to see this and understand what had really been happening behind the battle lines, what the Nazi regime had been doing while fighting a war on multiple fronts. American soldiers who'd fought their way across France and into Germany, who'd survived the Battle of the Bulge and countless smaller engagements, walked through Ordruff and came out changed. Officers reported that men who'd been joking and laughing an hour before were silent after touring the camp, sitting by themselves and staring at nothing. Some wrote letters home trying to describe what they'd seen but couldn't find the words. Others stopped writing entirely because how do you explain something like this to your wife or mother back in Kansas or California? Combat veterans who'd killed German soldiers in battle and felt conflicted about taking human lives suddenly felt no guilt at all, understanding now that every German soldier they'd killed was one less person supporting this system of death. On April 12th, the same day Patton toured Ordruff, he gathered American soldiers who'd just finished their forced march through the camp, men who looked like they'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. Men were sitting on the ground looking shell-shocked, some still crying openly without shame, others staring at nothing with hollow eyes that had seen too much. Patton stood before them, this general who was famous for being tough and demanding and sometimes cruel in his expectations. And when he spoke, his voice was steady but his hands were shaking, and several officers who were there that day said they'd never seen Patton shaken by anything until that moment. "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," he said, his words carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of absolute conviction. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." The soldiers understood immediately what he meant, that whatever propaganda they'd heard about stopping fascism or defending democracy was abstract compared to this concrete evidence of evil, that the piles of bodies and the skeletal survivors and the industrial apparatus of death made everything clear in a way that no speech or newsreel ever could. The mayor of Ordruff and his wife toured the camp the next day, along with other German civilians who'd been ordered at gunpoint to witness what their government had done in their name. They walked through the barracks and saw the bodies and heard the testimony of survivors who were barely alive, who used their last energy to point at buildings and explain what had happened there. The mayor and his wife didn't speak during the tour, just walked in silence taking in the horror, and when it was over they were escorted back to their homes. The mayor and his wife went home that afternoon and hanged themselves in their living room. Their suicide note said simply that they hadn't known, but now that they did know, they couldn't live with the knowledge that this had been happening so close while they'd done nothing. Other German civilians who toured the camp had different reactions. Some claimed the bodies were fake, that this was American propaganda designed to make Germans look bad, refusing to believe even when confronted with physical evidence. Others admitted they'd known something was wrong, that they'd seen the smoke and heard rumors but had been too afraid to ask questions or too comfortable to care. Patton wrote in his diary that night that Ordruff was the most horrible thing he'd ever seen, and he described in detail the piles of bodies and the condition of survivors and the evidence of torture and medical experiments. He wrote that he'd forced himself to look at everything, to examine every shed and every corner of the camp, to talk to survivors even when their stories made him want to scream, because if he was going to order other men to witness this horror, then he needed to witness all of it himself. He also wrote that he finally understood what this war had really been about, that it wasn't just about stopping German military expansion or Japanese imperialism, but about stopping something darker and more evil than he'd imagined possible. He wrote about the smell, how it got into your clothes and hair and skin, how he could still smell it hours later back at headquarters. He wrote about the survivors, how some were so weak they couldn't stand, how others had the energy to tell their stories but broke down crying in the middle. He wrote about his own soldiers, how they'd reacted with shock and rage and disgust, and how several had told him they now understood why they were here and what they were fighting for in a way they hadn't before. Within weeks, Eisenhower toured Buchenwald, the main camp that Ordruff had been connected to, and the experience affected him just as deeply. He sent cables to Washington and London urging political leaders and journalists to visit the camps immediately to see with their own eyes what was being discovered across Germany. He wrote that the evidence needed to be documented and publicized so completely that no one could ever deny what had happened, that future generations needed to know beyond any doubt that this wasn't propaganda or exaggeration but documented historical fact. General Omar Bradley toured another camp and said the experience made him physically ill, that he'd vomited twice during the tour and couldn't eat for a day afterward. British Prime Minister Churchill visited Bergen-Belsen and called it the most horrible day of his life, and Churchill had lived through 2 world wars and countless crises. American journalists were embedded with liberating forces, and their reports shocked readers back home who'd thought the stories about Nazi death camps were exaggerated propaganda, who'd assumed that wartime reporting always made things sound worse than they really were. Patton never forgot what he saw at Ordruff. He referenced it in speeches and interviews for the rest of his life, always saying that April 12, 1945, was the day he truly understood what the war had been about and why millions of men had died fighting it. The images stayed with him, appearing in his dreams and his quiet moments. The smell stayed with him, sometimes returning when he least expected it. The faces of those survivors stayed with him, especially the ones who'd looked at him with hope like American soldiers were saviors who'd arrived just in time. He felt guilty that they hadn't arrived sooner, that the camp had operated for months or years before being discovered, that thousands had died who might have been saved if the army had moved faster or if someone had believed the early reports. By the time World War II ended just a few weeks later, Allied forces had liberated dozens of concentration camps and documented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of others the Nazis had deemed undesirable, including Roma, homosexuals, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and disabled individuals. The evidence Patton and others insisted on collecting, the photographs and documents and testimony, became crucial at the Nuremberg trials where Nazi leaders faced justice for crimes against humanity. The world learned that Ordruff was just one tiny piece of a massive system of death that had operated across Europe, that the Nazis had built an entire infrastructure dedicated to extermination with camps like Auschwitz killing thousands per day at their peak. Patton died in a car accident in December 1945, just 7 months after liberating Ordruff, never knowing how his decision to document everything and force people to witness the camps would shape historical memory. The photographs his staff took, the reports they filed, the survivor testimony they recorded all became part of the permanent record that proved beyond doubt what had happened. When Holocaust deniers later tried to claim the camps were propaganda or exaggeration, the evidence collected by Patton and others made their lies impossible to sustain. The camps were real. The bodies were real. The survivors were real. The systematic murder of millions was real and documented and witnessed by thousands of Allied soldiers who never forgot what they saw. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault about the day General Patton discovered the true horror of Nazi Germany and made sure the world would never forget it. Next week we're covering the moment a single American soldier held off an entire German company for 12 hours and lived to tell about it. A story of courage that defies belief. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and if you want to support the channel and help us tell more stories like this, hit that like button because it really does help us reach more people who care about preserving these important moments from history.